Boldwood presents Sunrise Over Pebble Bay, written by Della Galton, and read by Nikki Diss. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Olivia Lambert closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The smell of cake filled her senses. The glorious sweetness of vanilla, almonds and sugar with an underlay of richly spiced fruit. Gorgeous. She never got tired of that smell. It helped that she adored fruitcake, every single delicious bit of it, from the exotically dark, sticky fruit to the sweetness of the thick, fondant icing. She'd loved it all since she was small and had learned to mix the ingredients in Aunt Dawn's kitchen. Her mother was a fine cook, but baking cakes had never come into her top 10 list of things to do on your day off. Baking cakes, and indeed icing them, was one of Aunt Dawn's many passions. Aunt Dawn had been the queen of cake makers in their family until she had handed Olivia her crown. Olivia opened her eyes. This cake, which was a gloriously unashamed celebration of pink, no gender-neutral theme here, was 3 tiers high. The bottom and middle tiers were pale pink, with a string of gold beads encircling them at their base. These were disguising the gap where the tiers were temporarily joined, and there was a big, slightly brighter pink bow wrapped around the centre tier. The bow was made of sugar paste, beautifully crafted so it was impossible to tell it wasn't real. The top tier, the smallest of the 3, was ivory. A trail of pink roses cascaded over one side, the roses painstakingly fashioned petal by petal in delicate curves and dotted with diamante sparkles. Proper bling, Olivia's mother would have said, but classy with it. On top of the cake, in pride of place, looking for all the world as though they'd been carelessly discarded there, nestled a pair of pink sugar paste baby shoes with white sugar paste flowers fashioned to look like daisies on each buckle. The shoes were a little smaller than life-size, but they were adorable, and just looking at them brought a lump to Olivia's throat. One day she would hold her own little girl in her arms and pop her foot into a tiny pink shoe made of some satiny material. Olivia blinked away the images swiftly. Creating christening cakes, especially for girls, not that she'd have minded a boy, always made her broody. She was now 39 and very aware that her biological clock was ticking. She continued with her inspection, checking for imperfections, making sure everything was just as it should be. Sitting inside one of the baby shoes was a tiny caramel-coloured teddy bear with chocolate drop eyes and a heart-shaped pink nose. He'd been fiddly, especially his jacket, but wow, he looked the part. The words Arabella's christening day were piped around the outside of the cake, above a date, 6th of March, which was this coming Saturday. Today was Thursday. Olivia smiled. The cake was gorgeous, even if she did say so herself. Arabella's parents were going to be very pleased. She hooked out her iPhone, took a series of pictures for the gallery on her website, and then carefully separated the tiers, ready to put them into the 3 cardboard carrying boxes that lay waiting on her worktop. The work wasn't quite over. The most nerve-wracking part of her job, by far, was the delivery. Whenever she could, she asked her clients to come to her, but Arabella's parents, the Greys, had asked her to deliver this one. She was slightly regretting agreeing to that. The Greys lived in a very upmarket house, the type with griffins on stone pillars either side of the drive, in the pretty Dorset village of Puddletown. Olivia lived and worked close to Weymouth Quay, in a mid-terrace house that overlooked a car park. According to the app on her phone, it was a 23-minute drive door to door. This was her next job, to deliver the cake safely, assemble and finish it on site, to gratefully accept the thanks of another happy customer, she hoped, along with the balance owing on their purchase, and to wish them well for Arabella's christening day. She leaned forward and gently lifted the top tier into the box, taking equal care with the other two. Then she lidded them all up carefully and pushed them back on the worktop just to be safe. With infinite care, she carried the first box through her open front door, nudging it back with her hip as she passed and into the March sunshine. She crossed the footway that ran alongside the public car park that abutted the row of terraced cottages, of which number 5, where she lived, was the middle one. It was a lovely afternoon for March. Not as warm as yesterday, but apparently it was getting warmer at the weekend, which would be good for spring holidaymakers and perfect for Arabella's christening, which was being held in a marquee in the Greys' back garden. Olivia's white van, which sported the sign, "Amazing Cakes, you imagine it, I'll create it," was in its usual space. There were advantages of living beside a car park, especially in the narrow streets around here that she and her Aunt Dawn, who lived a few minutes away, dubbed the back streets of Weymouth. In the height of summer, when the kids were off school, this car park got packed. At weekends, Olivia occasionally had to use her aunt's spare space, which was behind Vintage Views, her aunt's vintage clothes shop, which fronted the quay. Vintage clothes, like cakes, were another of Aunt Dawn's passions. Parking at her aunt's wasn't too much of an inconvenience. The trip back to number 5 on foot took less than 3 minutes, even including hurtling over Town Bridge, which was the lifting bridge across the harbour. Weymouth was jam-packed with pubs, cool cafes, interesting shops, and a plethora of places to eat freshly caught fish and diver-caught scallops, not to mention fish and chip takeaways patrolled by hungry seagulls. There was even a handy Indian takeaway on the other side of the car park, which came in useful when she didn't want to cook. She could also hire a dive boat or a jet ski should she ever feel the urge. Olivia felt extremely lucky to live in such a fabulous spot. As she ran back to collect the next cake box, she caught a whiff of cardamom and garlic wafting on the breeze, and her mouth watered. Maybe she'd get a takeaway later. She tried to restrict them to 1 a week, but it was tricky when she lived so close and was working flat out. Fortunately, one of her favourite ways of unwinding was to head off on regular 10k runs, which helped to offset a diet of king prawn madras, fish and chip suppers, and cake. Olivia was on the 3rd and final journey from kitchen to van when disaster struck. She tripped as she went out of her front door. She wasn't even sure how it happened. She wasn't hurrying. Knowing her tendency to be clumsy, especially when stressed, she never rushed a cake transportation, but somehow her foot caught on the raffia welcome mat, and the next thing she knew, she was stumbling over her threshold. For a split second, she thought she might save herself, or more importantly, in that moment, the top tier of Arabella's christening cake. She stumbled, righted, then didn't quite manage it and stumbled again clumsily and unstoppably, feeling as though she were falling in slow motion towards the tarmac walkway. There was nothing slow motion about the thump as she hit it. She yelped as pain shot through her wrist, which she'd put down to save herself. The cake box landed a few feet away. The box, which was clearly a lot less sturdy than it looked, burst apart, and the cake bounced out and was now in more than one piece. Several ivory-edged fruit chunks on the dirty pavement. For a few seconds, Olivia stayed where she was, half lying, half sitting. The shock of the fall, the hurt in her wrist, and the distress of wrecking so many painstaking hours of work competed for top place. The wrecked cake won, hands down. She had a strong urge to burst into tears. She swallowed it down. Tears were not going to help. In her bum bag, which was strapped around her waist, a permanent fixture when she was working, she both heard and felt the buzz of her mobile. More immediately vying for her attention was an elderly female passer-by. Olivia had an impression of a greying head in a purple jacket arriving beside her. The woman was wheeling a tartan shopper, and her kindly face was anxious. "Are you all right? Oh dear, your lovely cake." As she spoke, she bent down as if to pick up the pieces. "It's probably not as bad as it looks." Now crouched at the same level as Olivia, she broke off and bit her lip uncertainly. Even to the most optimistic of observers, it was clear she was wrong about this. The cake was a complete write-off. She turned her attention to Olivia. "Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine, thank you." Olivia rubbed her wrist and realised, thankfully, that this was true. Apart from the initial shock and the ignominy of falling over, she didn't seem to have done any lasting damage. Small blessings. But she was aware that other people in the car park and on the walkway were now looking in their direction. The last thing she needed was a bigger audience. With a small sigh, she got carefully to her feet. The woman, who'd been so verbose at first, was now clearly unsure what to do. She was still shaking her head. "It's nice of you to stop," Olivia told her, "but I'm fine, honestly." "If you're really sure." The woman sounded relieved. "I am." Olivia retrieved the split box and began to gather up the broken chunks of cake, even the quite small bits. A few feet away, an opportunist seagull was waiting, hopefully. It hopped a couple of steps closer as the woman grabbed the handle of her trolley, gave Olivia one last sympathetic nod, and went on her way. One of the baby shoes was damaged. The other was still in one piece. The teddy bear had lost an arm and now seemed to be eyeing her with a look of mild reproof. "I'm sorry," Olivia told it. Oh my God, now she was talking to a sugar-paste teddy bear. She was definitely losing the plot. Aunt Dawn must be right after all. She'd been working too hard. She'd been burning the candle at both ends. It was a bad habit of hers. This week had been frenetic. Every single second of her time had been accounted for, up to and including all day tomorrow. Especially tomorrow. Oh my God. Tomorrow. Again, she fought the urge to cry as she took the remnants of the cake back inside, then retrieved the other 2 tiers from her van and carried them carefully into the kitchen. She could hardly rock up at the Greys with 2/3 of a christening cake. Back in her sunny kitchen, the enormity of the disaster hit her. Delivering Arabella's cake would have finished her working week, at least as far as amazing cakes was concerned. Olivia's other profession, the one that didn't pay as well as baking, but was where her heart truly lay, was acting. She'd been to drama school after passing her A-levels, and she'd had a fair bit of success. She'd earned her equity card and had several small parts on television, as well as playing on stage when the opportunity arose. Last year she'd played Gertrude in Hamlet with a small but brilliant company she'd acted with before. They'd done the summer at Brownsea Island, but all of this paled into insignificance compared to tomorrow. Tomorrow morning she had a return ticket on the 6:55 a.m. Weymouth to London Waterloo to audition for a part in Casualty, the BBC's award-winning hospital drama. She'd sailed through the first audition. This was a callback. Her agent's voice echoed in her head. "They absolutely love you, darling. You're perfect for the part." Now she was down to the last 2. She and another actress had been shortlisted. It was the door to her future, and it had opened a tantalisingly big crack. She could not blow it. It was what she dreamed of since she was 13 and had told her startled parents that she wanted to be a prostitute when she left school, having just watched Pretty Woman. They'd been mightily relieved when they'd found out she meant an actress. Olivia looked back at the wrecked cake. She had never, in the 5.5 years since she'd launched Amazing Cakes, let anyone down, and she didn't intend to start now. But she could not be in two places at once. Casualty or Amazing Cakes? She was going to have to choose. Chapter 2. In her kitchen, Olivia ran through the conversation in her head with Arabella's mother, Juliet Gray. Olivia: I'm so sorry, but due to unforeseen circumstances, I'm afraid I can't now deliver your christening cake. Juliet: Oh, that's fine, dear. I'll pop into Waitrose and pick up another one. Except, of course, she was not going to say that. Even in Olivia's wildest dreams, which she had to admit could get pretty wild, and no matter how much it cost her, she knew she had to somehow honour the promise she had made. The promise that was written on the side of her van. You imagine it, I'll create it. And in the Greys' case, I'll deliver it. Her mobile buzzed again, and she hooked it out of her bum bag. 2 missed calls. One from Aunt Dawn and one from Juliet Gray, who she'd spoken to so often during the design and creation of this cake that she'd put her number in her contacts list. There was also a text from her boyfriend, Phil Grimshaw. Hey you, I've wangled tonight off. Shall I come over and make you some tea while we do a last-minute run-through of the script? What a darling. Phil was in the profession, like her. They'd met last year on the set of Hamlet. He'd played the best Claudius she'd ever seen. He was the perfect villain, dark and brooding, with a natural presence both on and off stage. He'd been brilliantly malevolent as the evil Claudius, and the audience had fallen silent every time he was in the spotlight. And Olivia had simply fallen for him. His other job, every actor Olivia knew had more than one job, was maitre d' at the Bluebell Cliff, a posh boutique hotel in Swanage. He must have pulled some strings to get tonight off to help her. That was lovely of him. He knew better than anyone how stressed out she'd been about tomorrow's audition, and usually the idea of seeing him would have made her heart leap. Half an hour ago she'd have texted back, yes, immediately. But this was not now going to happen. It was 4:20 p.m. She needed to make another cake, which would take about 3 hours to mix and bake, and another 3 or 4 hours to cool, and then she would be up all night decorating it. She'd be lucky if she was even done by the morning, not to mention delivering and setting up. No way would she be finished in time to catch the 6:55 to London, all fresh-faced and bright-eyed for the most important audition of her life. Her phone informed her that she had 2 voicemails, so one of them must be from Juliet Gray. A wild surge of hope swelled up. Maybe the christening had been cancelled. Maybe the vicar had double-booked, or the catering company had failed to live up to Juliet's incredibly exacting standards. Maybe there had been some freak weather in Puddletown and a small tornado had ripped through the Greys' acres of posh garden and demolished the hired marquee, and it would be too late to get a replacement. Or the harpist who was playing background music while the christening guests mingled and ate canapes had suddenly found that she was indisposed. Olivia knew so many details about the christening, she felt as though she was practically family. Her palms sweated as she dialed her voicemail and heard Juliet's plummy voice say, "Good afternoon, Olivia." All her hopes for a stay of execution were dashed with her client's next words. "I'm just phoning to let you know that when you come into the private road, it forks to the left and right. You need to take the left-hand fork, and as I said, we're the house with the griffins on the stone pillars. I wasn't sure if I told you this, and I didn't want you to get lost. Thanks, love." Juliet Gray was nice, as well as being plummy and pernickety. That somehow made it all feel so much worse. The phone rang again in her hand. Olivia dropped it in alarm on the worktop and then leaned forward nervously to look at the display. It wasn't Juliet. It was Aunt Dawn. She snatched it up, shaking with relief. "Darling, I'm not interrupting you, am I? Only I'm in a bit of a quandary." "What quandary?" There was something in her aunt's voice that made Olivia's heart clench. Oh no, please, not more problems. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, but Emmeline isn't, unfortunately. I've just got in my car to take her to the vet's, but it won't start, and I wondered maybe... But only if you're free." Olivia's heart sank. She glanced at the digital clock on her oven and swallowed. Yes, I'm free." She wasn't in the habit of lying, but Aunt Dawn knew how hectic her life was, and she never asked her to do anything unless it was really, really important. Emmeline may only be a chicken, but her aunt doted on her little flock of ex-battery hens, all of which were named after famous women she admired, from Emmeline Pankhurst to Claudia Winkleman. They were right up there at the top of her list of passions, ahead of fabulous cakes and even vintage clothes. "She's in a box," Aunt Dawn continued a little breathlessly. "I'm right here with her. I'll start walking. Save time." Blimey, it must be urgent. Olivia bit her lip. "OK, I'll meet you in the car park in 5 minutes." Her aunt disconnected, and Olivia stared at the wrecked pink cake box on the side. Phoning Juliet would have to wait. Making another cake would have to wait, too. She would need a miracle to resolve this one, preferably in the next 5 minutes. But right now she needed to focus on Aunt Dawn. She grabbed her keys and dashed out of the door. Deciding her aunt must be really worried to be in such a rush, she didn't wait in the car park but started jogging towards Weymouth Quay to meet her. Hens may be almost as light as air, but it would still be awkward manhandling a cardboard box up across Town Bridge and down the stone steps. Today the water in the harbour looked green. It sparkled in the afternoon sun. Not that much different than the green painted underside of the bridge itself. Aunt Dawn wasn't difficult to spot. She was halfway across and was wearing a long red and white polka dot skirt and her favourite vintage denim jacket, which had gorgeous pink and red beaded flowers all over it, although her top half was mostly obscured by the cardboard box. She was puffing slightly when Olivia reached her and didn't see her until the last minute. "Oh, hello, darling. I'm so sorry. I don't want to hold you up." "You're not?" When had she become such an accomplished liar? "Shall I take her?" Olivia opened her arms for the box, which was punched with air holes in both sides, and her aunt reluctantly relinquished her precious cargo. Dawn's face was flushed. That must be worry, Olivia surmised, because she was one of the fittest 62-year-olds she knew. Tendrils of dark curly hair escaping from a workman-like plait framed her pretty face. "Thank you." Worried brown eyes that Olivia knew were a mirror image of her own met hers. "I'm so grateful you could step in." "We'll soon get her sorted out." Olivia hoped she was right. Chickens were fragile creatures, and she needed to make that cake. Her stomach crunched with anxiety as they fell into step on the bridge. They were the same height, 5'9.5", and they were the spitting image of each other. Instead of inheriting her mother's fair hair and English rose colouring like her sister Ruby had, Olivia looked like her aunt. They had the same dark brown, unruly hair, except Olivia's was longer, slightly olive skin and delicate bone structure. They were often mistaken for mother and daughter. Although Aunt Dawn declared that Olivia was the spit of Coronation Street's Alison King, she was a big fan of Corrie, and she proclaimed herself to be Alison King plus a lifetime of laughter lines. A pretty accurate description. Olivia dragged her thoughts away from soap dramas. despite the fact today seemed to be turning into one, and concentrated on negotiating the stone steps off the bridge. She definitely couldn't afford to drop another box of precious cargo. A few moments later, they were at the back of her van. She put the boxed-up Emmeline gently on her aunt's knees, as requested. At least something good had come out of the cake catastrophe. If this afternoon had gone according to plan, she wouldn't have been able to do this for at least another hour and a half, and that might have been too late. "What do you think's wrong with Emmeline?" she asked, as they sped along the back streets. "You are still using the same vet, aren't you?" "Yes, Mike Turner, the white building on the corner of Park Street." "I know the one. I'm not sure what's wrong with her. She may be egg-bound. She's been in the coop on her nest, poor little thing. I thought she was struggling at lunchtime. I'm hoping I haven't left it too long." "I thought you'd be working in the shop." "I was, but luckily I went out the back about half an hour ago to check on Emmeline." Olivia nodded. Her aunt lived in the flat above her shop, which was like a TARDIS and had a lot more space inside than there looked to be from the outside. At one end of the building was a fire exit that led out onto a 6-foot square terrace, which in turn led down into what Olivia had called the secret garden when she was small. It was an idyllic space, full of pots and hanging baskets, and it dropped down in a series of levels that were connected by steps and narrow pathways until you got to the lowest level, which had a wall around it and a gate that led to the back of the shop. A fluttering and a scratching from the boxed-up Emmeline reminded Olivia of their rescue mission as she drew into the vet's large car park and found a space. Mike Turner, who reminded Olivia a bit of her old science teacher, but who had a lot more charisma, turned out to be brisk and efficient. He confirmed the egg-bound diagnosis, administered a calcium shot to the docile hen, and gave them a list of instructions. "She should be fine. She's very healthy," he reassured. "Keep an eye on her for the next couple of hours." Her aunt looked hugely relieved as she stroked Emmeline's silky black feathers. Olivia had been so focused on the rescue mission that she hadn't thought about her own problems, but now they flicked back into her mind with a vengeance. The vet trip had taken less than an hour. It was nearly 5:30. Just before they left the vet's, she checked her phone. There were no more calls from Juliet Gray, thank God. But there would be soon, she was sure. She needed to phone her and explain why she hadn't arrived at the scheduled time, and she needed a plan of action. She still couldn't bear to think about tomorrow. "You're very quiet," Aunt Dawn murmured on the journey back. "What's going on? Is it that new man of yours?" "No, Phil's fine. He's lovely." She remembered she hadn't answered his text either. Neither was he very new. They'd been seeing each other nearly 10 months, but in Aunt Dawn's world, anything less than a year was just the other day. "So what is it?" There was no point in beating about the bush. Her aunt knew her too well. She told her what had happened. Aunt Dawn said when she'd finished. "Awkward. I don't suppose you've got another cake in stock you could use?" "Not fruit, no. Not so many people want it these days." "Why were you taking the cake today, anyway, if the christening's not until Saturday?" "It's a long story, but one of the reasons is that they have a photographer coming tomorrow to take snaps for the family album of a relative who can't make Saturday because they're out of the country. They're doing a mock-up of the christening. It's that kind of family. They've got a marquee in the garden, a harpist, caterers coming in." She broke off. "It's kind of irrelevant anyway, isn't it? I'd agreed to drop the cake off today, and now I can't." "But first thing tomorrow would be okay." "I think it would. They could still do the photo shoot. We said today to allow for unforeseen circumstances. Juliet Gray is a risk-averse kind of lady." She shook her head as they pulled up at a traffic light. "It's just as well she is." She took a deep breath. "I'm going to have to tell her. Then I'm going to have to make another top tier and re-ice it." I can help you. What about Emmeline? The vet said you needed to keep an eye on her. We can do that at yours. We'll go back to number 5. Olivia opened her mouth to protest that having Emmeline in her kitchen broke every hygiene and health and safety law in the book, and then shut it again. Aunt Dawn knew that. What about the shop? Is Lydia there? Lydia Brooks was her aunt's right-hand woman, a small, bustling, smiley woman in her 50s who was a specialist in lace and brocade. What she didn't know about vintage fashion wasn't worth knowing. No, she's off today. I closed up early, it's fine. The shop would be shut in another half hour anyway, and I'm not expecting any deliveries or pickups. Passing trade will come back if they want something. Olivia stopped arguing as they arrived back at number 5. Fortunately, her space was still free. As they went into the kitchen, complete with Emmeline, who was clearly feeling better because she shifted in her box and clucked with indignation as they moved her again, Olivia spotted some crumbs of pink icing scattered like confetti around her back step, a reminder of her clumsiness. I'll put Emmeline in the lounge, shall I, love? It was a rhetorical question. Her aunt had already disappeared. A few moments later, having left the recuperating hen with water and making sure she was comfy, Dawn was back again. They both washed their hands at the small sink that Olivia had installed, in addition to the main one, to comply with the endless regulations there were when you bake commercially from your kitchen. What else are you supposed to be doing this evening? Dawn inquired. And tomorrow morning? She clapped her hands over her mouth. Oh, Lord! Your casualty audition! That's tomorrow! How did I forget that? You've had other things on your mind. Olivia shook her head. I need to cancel it. I'm not going to make it. Even if I could do another cake in time, I still need to deliver it first thing. I can't be in 2 places at once. She sighed. I haven't even told the client what's happened yet. It was literally just before you rang that I dropped the cake. Oh, my darling, and you didn't say a word. Bless you, that's so typical of you. Did you hurt yourself? I don't think I did my wrist much good, but no lasting damage. Let me look. Olivia held up her hand. Not even bruised. See? It's fine. Good. Right then. Aunt Dawn straightened her shoulders, apparently satisfied. Don't worry. Her dark eyes were soft as she touched her niece's arm. We've got this. We have? Absolutely. She gestured towards the laminated sign over the cooker. The impossible we can do at once. Miracles might take a little longer. Olivia's mobile rang. It was Juliet Gray again. Panicking, she dropped it like a hot baking tray onto the worktop. That's the client. What shall I say? Well, usually I'd say full disclosure is best, but I'm guessing you don't want to panic her. I don't. I can't. Shall I speak to her? Olivia mouthed an uncertain yes, and Dawn picked up the mobile before she could change her mind. Good afternoon. Amazing cakes. How may I help? Olivia held her breath as her aunt listened to what was clearly quite a long babble of words from an anxious Juliet. May I stop you there for a second? She said. I was just about to phone you. There's been a family emergency which Olivia is dealing with now. Your cake is done, but we will have to defer delivery until first thing tomorrow morning. I understand you need your cake tomorrow, so would 9 a.m. sharp suit? Her voice was a mixture of calm and authoritative. Then she listened to the response carefully. Thank you for being so understanding. Yes, these things happen. Quite. Thank you. That's very sweet of you. I'll pass on your regards. We'll see you at 9. She disconnected. Not a problem, she said, and glanced at the clock. It was approaching 6 p.m. Have you got all the ingredients, love? I think so. I better cancel the audition, and I really need to tell Phil not to come round tonight, unless he wants to help us make sugar paste roses. Don't cancel anything. Aunt Dawn had fire in her voice. I can deliver your cake in the morning, and I can do the finishing for you on site. Well, Mrs. Gray was very understanding. Are you sure? Olivia felt a fizz of hope thread through her despair. Damn right, I'm sure. Let's get cracking. Chapter 3. An hour later, the ingredients were weighed out and mixed, and the 6-inch cake was in the oven. The timer was set for 10 p.m, which was the earliest it would be ready. The kitchen was beginning to fill up with the rich, sweet scents of slowly baking fruitcake. While Aunt Dawn had made the cake, Olivia had been cutting shapes out of pink sugar paste icing at the kitchen table. She had a pattern for the baby shoes and had completed a new pair in record speed. There were just the sugar daisies on the buckles to make. Then she would start on the teddy bear. Briefly, she'd contemplated repairing the original, but it was too risky. If even the tiniest bit of grit had got into the sugar paste, it would be a disaster. A huge amount of time went into making her kitchen a sterile place to work. It wasn't just about the environmental health inspections, which could happen at any time. It was about her reputation. She had a dread of a hair ending up in a cake, or something else that wasn't supposed to be there. The cake itself would take between 3 and 4 hours to cool enough to be rough iced. Rough icing a cake is the equivalent to putting primer on a wall you're painting. It's unseen but essential in order to make the final version perfect. She couldn't rough ice until the early hours, but fortunately a lot of the decorative work could be done in advance. She was trying not to think about the roses. Even with both of them working, they'd be struggling to finish them before midnight. Olivia hadn't realised she was frowning until her aunt came across to the table. She smoothed down the apron she'd borrowed, which was white, with the words "head cook" emblazoned on it, and said, "Don't look so worried. Apart from the fact that we're working against the clock, I really enjoyed that." "Thanks again. I really appreciate this. I'll make some more coffee. Phil should be here soon. He said he's always wanted to make sugar paste roses." "I can do the coffee." Aunt Dawn went to the sink. "The more I know about your Phil, the more I like him." Olivia softened. "Phil's great. He also said he'll bring supplies for the chefs, something we can eat while we work, being as time is of the essence." "So then," Aunt Dawn's voice had gone ultra-casual, "while we're on the subject of your Phil, how is it going? Is it getting serious? Or is this just a casual fling? Not that I want to pry, darling. Tell me to mind my own, if you like." "When have I ever told you to do that? No, it's fine. It's going great, actually. He's amazing. He's thoughtful, kind, smart, not to mention amazingly hot. Sorry, too much information. I'm not completely blind. I can see the boy's hot." She rolled her eyes. "And it must be good going out with a fellow thespian, is it?" "Yes, it is. He totally gets it. The hope, the heartbreak. He's had the whole acting bug thing as long as I have. He's just as obsessed as I am. We both have the same dream. One day we'll get that breakthrough role, even though we haven't yet." She sighed. "It's different for men. There's always lots of good parts for guys. Age isn't so much of a thing." As they'd been talking, Olivia had been fashioning the sugar paste daisies for the baby shoes, and now she stuck them gently onto the buckles. She was aware that her aunt was back at the kitchen table, and they both looked at the finished shoes. "Age isn't so much of a thing for guys when it comes to starting a family, either," Olivia said softly. "It doesn't matter that Phil's 41. He can probably father children right up until he's in his 70s and beyond, but it matters that I've just turned 39. I feel as though every month that goes past lessens my chances of being a mum." Suddenly she couldn't speak. There was too much of an ache in her throat. She hadn't realised until she'd said the words how much she cared. And something darker was in her heart too. Fear. She was so afraid it would never happen, that she'd never get the chance to hold her own baby in her arms, that her dreams of having her own family would break apart and fall into the dirt like the smashed christening cake. She felt a tear roll down her cheek, and she closed her eyes. Bloody hell, where had this come from? She heard the scrape of chair legs at the table, and Aunt Dawn sat beside her and put an arm around her shoulders. "Oh, my darling, I didn't know you were feeling like this." "Neither did I until we started talking about it." Olivia laid her head against her aunt's bony shoulder. "I'm sorry. I'm just tired and stressed out. I feel as though the clock's ticking." She glanced at the oven and bit her lip, in more ways than one. "Hey, you've got plenty of time. Lots of women start their families in their 40s these days." She pulled a pristine white hanky out of her pocket. She always had hankies, white monogrammed vintage ones. Olivia sniffed and took it and wiped her face. "I know they do, but I've never even been pregnant. Some of my friends have had scares, but I haven't. And after what happened with Tom..." She broke off. Tom Boyd was her ex, and one of the reasons she hadn't yet started a family. But the subject of her ticking biological clock and Tom's laissez-faire attitude towards it were the last thing she wanted to be talking about when Phil arrived. "I'm sorry. Can we change the subject?" "Of course we can. I'll get started on the roses." "That would be brilliant. Are you really sure about taking the cake tomorrow? We're not going to get much sleep." "I've always thought sleep's overrated," Aunt Dawn said briskly. "Thank you," Olivia whispered, "so much. Not just for the cake." Her aunt's eyes softened in acknowledgement as Olivia slid out of her chair and escaped to the bathroom. She wasn't a good crier. Her skin always went blotchy. She splashed water onto her cheekbones and then retied her dark hair back up on top of her head. Now Tom was in her mind, it was hard to get him out again. They'd met in 2010 when she was 28 and he was 33 at a wedding exhibition at Olympia. At the time, she'd been baking cakes for a wedding planning company prior to setting up her own cake-making company, and he'd been selling diamonds. Tom was a brilliant salesman. He had one of those faces that people trusted, and he could literally sell anything, although she'd discovered later that he tended to focus on high-end commodities. In his career to date, he'd sold Sunseeker boats, shepherd's huts to rich landowners, and holiday homes in Iceland. He'd asked her for a coffee when they'd had a break at the exhibition, and they realised they actually lived within 5 miles of each other in Weymouth and had a mutual friend who was a member of the same gym they were. Not that either of them went. They laughed about this. They laughed about a lot in that half an hour, and when he'd asked rather shyly whether he could take her to dinner the following weekend, Olivia had agreed happily. She was only slightly fazed when he took her to the most expensive restaurant in town. They both laughed when he told her he was just trying to impress her, and after that it would be McDonald's all the way. It wasn't, though. Tom Boyd was very wealthy. That quickly became apparent. But he wasn't ever flashy, and neither did he take it for granted. "I work really hard, and I've also been lucky," he told her. "I like nice things, but I may not always have money. I'm only as good as my last commission. Let me spoil you while the going's good." Olivia had always been fiercely independent, but she had to admit it was lovely being spoiled. Their relationship had slowly become more serious. They wanted the same things: stability, socialising with friends. They both loved their work. He liked the fact she was an actress and had actually been in things he'd heard of. He liked showing her off. They both wanted kids, one day in the future when the time was right. There was no rush. Seeing as they both worked and operated in the wedding biz scene, neither was keen on marriage. They'd both seen it as an unnecessary label. It had been Olivia who changed her mind first, just after she'd turned 33. She'd mentioned it to him in passing, in a wouldn't-it-be-nice kind of way, and he'd seemed hesitant. Then, to her surprise, 3 weeks later, when they were on a weekend away in Florence, he'd proposed. It had been the most incredibly romantic proposal. Tom was the king of big romantic gestures. They'd just been for lunch in a gorgeous open-air trattoria, and they'd been walking back towards their hotel, towards Ponte Vecchio, the famous bridge lined with goldsmiths and jewellers, when Tom had grabbed her hand and pulled her towards a shop window. "What is it?" she'd asked, slightly alarmed, when he dropped to one knee on the pavement and grinned up at her. "Marry me, Olivia. Live with me forever and be my wife." Several passers-by stopped to watch. The Italians did have a reputation for being the most romantic of all Europeans, after all. Hadn't they invented the language of love? And it was obvious to everyone exactly what was going on. "Of course I'll marry you," Olivia had said, tugging him to his feet and kissing him, to the delight of the crowd of cheering, applauding onlookers. She realised that they had stopped outside the most expensive, most exclusive jewellers, and they went straight in to buy Olivia a ring. "Why didn't you buy it in advance?" she had teased as they'd browsed the trays of diamonds. "Did you think I'd say no?" "I wanted you to choose," he'd murmured, touching her cheek. "I didn't want to make a mistake." The romance of that weekend had shone brightly over the next year and had only tarnished slightly when another 2 years had passed without them actually setting a date for the wedding. "There is no rush to set a date for the wedding," Tom had said, and she had agreed, even though she was beginning to think this was the longest engagement in history. 5 years after the engagement, when even Aunt Dawn had begun asking whether they still planned to get married, Olivia had raised it with Tom, and that, she'd finally realised with hindsight, had been the beginning of the end. "I'd like us to start a family, Tom," she had said one evening when they were eating at Harbour Views, their favourite fish restaurant, which was contemporary and served gorgeous food, but had cold, tiled floors and modern, slightly uncomfortable furniture. "I know it's old-fashioned, but I'd really like us to be married when we do." They'd just finished their main course, seafood linguine, which was to die for and all sourced locally. Tom reached across the glass table and took both her hands in his, and there was something in his face that had stilled her. "I've been thinking about families, Olivia." He frowned and chewed absently at the corner of his lip, and then he'd dropped a bombshell. "The thing is, I'm not sure whether I actually want one." She looked at him in shock. "But you've always wanted kids. You've always said that when the time's right—" She broke off. He was nodding, but his blue eyes were shadowed. "I know what I said, and believe me, I meant it. But it's been on my mind a lot lately, and I don't think I do. I love my life, our life, as it is. I don't need kids to complete it. In fact, I don't think they would complete it. I think it might be the opposite." He'd rubbed at the 5 o'clock shadow on his chin, while Olivia stared at him in disbelief. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This was such a complete turnaround. Or was it? Suddenly, his reluctance to set a date for the wedding made a lot more sense. "How long have you been feeling like this?" she'd asked. "I don't know. 6 months? Maybe a year?" He shrugged. "Does it matter?" "Yes, I think it does." She knew suddenly that it had been much longer than a year. He must have had doubts for ages. She pulled her hands from his. "It doesn't affect us," he said, looking anguished. "I still want to marry." "Of course it affects us." She cut across him. "I do want a family, Tom. It's what I've always wanted, as you know. But I can't have one by myself, can I?" She was shocked at the bitterness in her own voice, and he'd clearly heard it too. He looked stricken. "I know, but—" He blew out through his teeth. "Look at what happened to Alfie and Lynn." For a second she'd paused, and her heart gave a wild swing of hope. Maybe that's what this was all about. Alfie and Lynn were two of his closest friends. He'd been best man at their wedding. They'd married when they were both in their 30s, but had trouble conceiving. After 5 rounds of IVF, they'd finally got their much-wanted twins, who'd been born premature. But the trauma of the whole thing had been so great that they'd ended up splitting up, and were now in the throes of an acrimonious divorce. "You've been talking a lot to Alfie?" she asked. "Yeah, a lot. Having a family hasn't brought him any joy. Au contraire, he's totally messed up. That doesn't mean it's going to happen to us, Tom. I might fall pregnant straight away. We've never even tried. I've never even missed a pill." That wasn't quite true, but it hadn't happened often, and she'd always made sure they'd used some other form of contraception if it had. Her mother had a lot to answer for in this respect, as both herself and Ruby had been conceived the first time she'd tried to get pregnant, which had left both of them with the impression it would be incredibly risky to do as much as breathe while a boy was present. She had held Tom's gaze, and he'd nodded slowly, and for the longest moment Olivia had thought he was considering what she'd just said. She went on quickly. "When my parents wanted a baby, they got pregnant the first time they tried, and here I am, the living proof. Same with Ruby. They didn't split up. They've always been blissfully happy." Tom lowered his eyes. "I don't want a family. I'm really sorry. I truly thought I did. But I've made up my mind. Please don't walk away from me. Just say that you'll think about it for a while. Think through the pros and cons." Olivia didn't walk away. Not at first. They'd talked and they'd cried, but neither of them had budged an inch. She was desperate for a family. Tom was completely against having one. In the end, the only possible solution had been to end the relationship. They'd been together for just over 10 years. She had been shocked to the core. His complete turnaround had devastated her. She didn't think she'd have felt any worse if he'd gone off with someone else. The sound of her doorbell flicked Olivia back into the present, and a few moments later she heard voices in her kitchen. Phil must have arrived. Hurriedly, she rubbed away some smudged mascara and reapplied foundation. She and Phil were still at the stage where she wanted to keep the illusion of having perfect skin and being beautiful. She'd never decided whether this was insecurity or vanity. After all, he already knew what she looked like with no makeup on. They quite often woke up in the same bed at weekends. When she got back to the kitchen, Phil was chatting to her aunt. She felt a twang of lust. He was gorgeous. Even with his black hair a bit windswept. In fact, especially with his hair a bit windswept, and still in his work jacket that fitted snugly over his broad shoulders. Her sister Ruby reckoned he looked like Aidan Turner in Poldark, and it was true. He broke off when he saw her. "I see that Operation Save the Day is in full swing. How's it going?" He dangled a carrier bag from the fingers of one hand. "I nipped into M&S and got not just nibbles. I'll put them on plates and we can help ourselves, yes?" "Brilliant, thanks." She went across and kissed him, aware that her aunt had busied herself making coffees. "I'll just stick my jacket in your lounge," Phil said, shrugging it off as he spoke. "Save cluttering up the kitchen." He disappeared, but was back very quickly, wearing a slightly bemused expression. "Did you know?" There's a chicken sitting on your sofa," he asked Olivia. He opened his fingers to reveal something in his palm, and she seems to have laid you an egg. Chapter 4. A disgruntled and loudly protesting Emmeline was recaptured and returned to her box, and Aunt Dawn moved her into the darkened bathroom and came back into the kitchen with an apologetic look at Olivia. "Sorry about that. She'll roost now it's night time anyway. I'm so relieved she's okay. I'd have known she'd escape from that box. When I first got to her, she was forever trying to escape from the coop, and once she got herself stuck in the net."